Welcome to Hidden World. Today we go under Berlin. Beneath the streets of the German capital lies a second city. It is a landscape of bunkers and tunnels, flooded rail lines and secret rooms, forgotten stations and buried rivers. Every era left something behind. Medieval cellars still hold cool air near the Spree. 19th century engineers carved sewers and pumping caverns as the city exploded in size after 1860. The Empire and the Republic built tunnels for trams, and then for the U-Bahn and S-Bahn. The Third Reich poured concrete by the cubic meter to protect a capital that would be bombed for 5 years. The Cold War superpowers added control rooms and listening posts and civil defense shelters that could seal for weeks. After the fall of the wall, developers and planners reshaped the ground again with new rail tunnels, flood basins, fiber conduits, and secure corridors for the government quarter. This underworld is not myth. It is measured in kilometers and in concrete tons and in dates. The Hobrecht urban plan of 1862 mapped a radial sewer network that by the early 20th century reached across the city with dozens of pumping stations. During the Second World War, the Royal Air Force alone dropped more than 45,000 tons of bombs on Berlin. The result was a web of shelters for civilians and a hardened core for the regime. From August 1961 to November 1989, a concrete ring of about 155 kilometers split families and neighborhoods. Under it rose a clandestine world of escape tunnels and ghost stations. Today, the underground is both an archive and a machine that keeps the modern city alive. We will walk that map now and read the city from below. Part 2. When air raids became routine by 1943, the Nazi state ordered a new level of protection for the capital. Berlin filled with reinforced basements, purpose-built air raid shelters, and administrative bunkers. The most infamous address was the Führer Bunker, a 2-level complex near the Reich Chancellery in Mitte. Its upper section dated to 1936. The deeper section was completed by 1944 as the war turned against Germany. The lower bunker sat roughly 8 meters below ground, with heavy reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling several meters thick. 30 or so rooms held offices, a conference room, sleeping quarters, stores, and the ventilation plant. In those narrow corridors, the regime collapsed in April 1945. Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun on the 29th of April. On the 30th, he took his life. In early May, Soviet troops secured the area. Over the next years, the site was stripped and sealed. The surface is now a plain parking lot with a small information board not far from the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. Nothing about the asphalt suggests the last days of the Third Reich played out below it. The capital hosted many other fortified structures. The Reichsbahn bunker near Friedrichstrasse was built in 1942 with thick walls and hundreds of beds and storage rooms. It later served as a banana warehouse in the post-war years, an improbable afterlife for a fortress designed for total war. In the north at Humboldt-Hain and in the east at Friedrichshain rose massive flak towers. They were concrete mountains with walls several meters thick and high platforms for anti-aircraft guns. The Zoo flak towers stood in Tiergarten. After 1945, the Allies destroyed much of them with explosives, but remnants survived. In Humboldthain, a chunk of the giant still stands, and some of its interior chambers and galleries survive in the dark. Beneath these monuments ran a lattice of smaller bunkers. Apartment block cellars were reinforced with arched brick and concrete ribs. Signs painted with luminous paint pointed to exits. In some neighborhoods, public shelters were integrated into U-Bahn stations with added blast doors and chemical filters. By late 1944, many of these spaces were tested in real conditions as raids intensified. Civilians compressed into every square meter of underground space while the city burned above. The heat of firestorms cracked ceilings, water pipes burst and flooded corridors. The system held in some places and failed in others. The endgame brought new damage. In early May 1945, explosions and fire led to flooding in parts of the rail tunnels. Water from canals poured through breaks into the U-Bahn and S-Bahn network. Entire sections went under, and the lower tunnels filled with dark water that took months to pump out. The underworld of the Nazi capital closed with water, ruin, and silence. Part 3. When the Berlin Wall rose in August 1961, it was a concrete scar that cut through streets and tunnels alike. Border engineers sealed station entrances and bricked over service corridors. Yet the underground also became a frontier for the desperate and the daring. Students, engineers, and families on both sides plotted tunnels that could run under cellars, courtyards, and roadbeds to reach the free sector. One of the most famous efforts was Tunnel 29 in 1962. Digging teams worked from a factory in the west toward a courtyard in the east. They shifted about 45 cubic meters of earth by hand, hauling clay in buckets and silent sleds. The tunnel ran roughly 135 meters. On the evening of the breakout, 29 East Berliners scrambled through a narrow shaft to the west. The story became global when a television network in the United States bought documentary rights and funded part of the work. Another dramatic escape was Tunnel 57 in October 1964. It began under a disused bakery on the western side and reached a basement in the east. 57 people emerged before the operation was exposed. That night, a young East German border guard was shot and killed during a chaotic confrontation, a tragic marker on a line that had already claimed many lives. There were dozens of other attempts. Some failed due to informers. Others collapsed in sand and groundwater. The geology of Berlin made digging risky. The city sits on layers of sand and glacial till with a high water table. Tunnels had to be shored with timber, sheet metal, or scavenged pipes. Digging could take months and required precise surveying with homemade instruments. Ventilation had to be improvised. The teams built air pumps from vacuum cleaner parts and used field phones for communication. A minor mistake could flood a tunnel or bring a ceiling down. The official border system measured about 155 kilometers around West Berlin at its peak. It included concrete walls about 3.5 meters tall, more than 300 watchtowers, floodlights, signal fences, patrol roads, and dog runs. Even with that apparatus, the underground route remained a crack in the system. Historians have documented at least 70 attempts at escape tunnels during the wall years. Only a fraction succeeded. The wall-era death toll in Berlin is at least 140 people. Underground stories are a small but gripping part of that number. They testify to the creativity and the risk taken by ordinary citizens who could not accept a divided city. Part 4. The Cold War turned Berlin into a fortress of intelligence and civil defense. West Berlin invested in shelters and emergency plans. A number of U-Bahn stations, such as Pankstraße, were fitted to serve as civil defense shelters that could be sealed. Pankstraße held beds, generators, air filters, kitchens, and medical rooms. It was designed to sustain several thousand people for as long as 2 weeks, with water and supplies stored in back rooms. Jungfernheide also gained shelter fittings. The Cold War shelter network offered places for tens of thousands, a fraction of the 2 million residents of West Berlin. It was a symbolic reassurance and a practical tool for a limited-scale emergency. Signals intelligence was the other underground story, even when it stood on a hill. The best vantage point in the city is man-made. Teufelsberg rises in the west to about 120 meters above sea level. It is a mountain of rubble. Millions of cubic meters of brick and concrete collected from bombed buildings and piled over the remains of an unfinished Nazi military faculty. On the summit, the United States and the United Kingdom built a listening station in the late 1950s. White radomes swelled like spheres in the sky. Inside, antenna arrays fed receivers that mapped the radio spectrum of the Warsaw Pact. The station operated into the early 1990s, eavesdropping on air traffic control, military communications, and microwave links across the border. Beneath the hill, the remains of the Nazi-era structure still linger, a ghost base under a Cold War ear. East Berlin maintained its own network of command posts, communications hubs, and storage bunkers. The Ministry for State Security guarded secret telephone exchanges, archival vaults, and secure rooms. In a crisis, the East German leadership had designated shelters both in Berlin and outside the city. The Soviet garrison in the capital also maintained hardened facilities. Much of this infrastructure was dismantled or sealed in the 1990s. Some sites are preserved as museums, others remain closed behind fences or are lost under new construction. The Cold War ended in 1989 and 1990, but its underground imprint remains. The listening station towers still watch the forest. Civil defense doors and pressure valves still hang in certain stations. The city carries a memory of a time when weeks of sealed living were planned for, and when antennas listened to every band of the sky. Part 5. Berlin is a rail city. The first U-Bahn line opened in 1902. The S-Bahn North-South Tunnel opened in 1939. By the eve of the war, the map was dense with lines that threaded under the river and beneath the old streets. That density created an underground that is part machine and part museum. Some stations went out of service and remained frozen in time. During the wall years, trains from West Berlin crossed parts of East Berlin without stopping and passed through dim platforms known as ghost stations. Guards stood on those platforms while trains rolled past. Signage was removed or painted over. The platforms collected dust and silence for nearly 3 decades. After 1989, the sealed stairwells were opened, and by the mid-1990s, the ghost stations returned to service. One of the most debated episodes of the war years involved the flooding of the rail tunnels in late April and early May 1945. Explosions near canal walls sent water into some tunnels, and breaches between lines spread the flood. The low sections filled first. Passengers and soldiers tried to escape through dark stairwells and ventilation shafts. The exact number of victims is unknown. The images of drowned stations and drowned trains haunted the city for years after. The Unterwelten Association, founded in 1997, turned parts of this rail underworld into a classroom. Tours move through a preserved air raid shelter at Gesundbrunnen, where luminous arrows still glow under ultraviolet light. You can see beds bolted to walls, filters that were meant to stop poison gas, and the narrow passageways that residents of Wedding once packed during raids. Other tours trace the flow of weapons caches and civil defense facilities in the Cold War. The goal is not thrill, but understanding and stewardship. By mapping the underworld, the city avoids both amnesia and myth. The modern network keeps growing. The U5 extension opened in December 2020, linking Alexanderplatz to Brandenburger Tor and adding new stations at Roths Rathaus, Museumsinsel, and Unter den Linden. Construction required precision tunneling under the historic heart of the city. Engineers froze soil near the Spree to drive a tunnel without settlement. The Museumsinsel station opened in 2021 with a ceiling design that evokes a slow underwater night. The past and the present meet in that blue light as trains hum where monks once walked. Part 6. Before Berlin had rails, it had water. The city grew on marshland and sandbanks near the Spree and Havel. The 19th century brought science to that fragile ground. The Hobrecht Plan of 1862 laid out a system of radial sewers that carried waste to pumping stations and then out to sewage farms beyond the city. By the early 20th century, the city operated a network that today stretches for thousands of kilometers. Under manholes and cobbles lie brick egg-shaped conduits and concrete pipes that echo with a constant low rush. Some of those old brick sewers still function alongside modern tunnels. Several streams that once ran in the open are now culverted. The Panke, a small river from the north, disappears into channels as it nears the center and then returns to daylight near the Spree. The Loisenstadt Canal was cut in the 19th century between the Spree and the Landwehr Canal, then filled in the early 20th century when it became a stagnant ditch. Its old path is now a green ribbon on the surface, while beneath it lie utilities and soil that still remembers the canal bed. Engineers learned to respect groundwater here. Berlin sits on a high water table. Construction sites pump constantly. Any deep tunnel requires careful dewatering or soil freezing, and engineers monitor nearby building foundations to prevent settlement. There are older underground spaces too. Medieval church crypts once stored bones and provided quiet refuges. Many were damaged in the fires of the war or filled in the rebuilding that followed. Archaeological digs before new developments often find wells, cellars, and wooden piles driven by craftsmen centuries ago. The city is layered like a book. A cellar from 1750 may sit under a shop from 1880, under an office from 1930, under a station built in 1970. Every stratum tells a story of adaptation to water and to war. Modern Berlin uses its underground watercraft in new ways. Stormwater retention basins and interceptor tunnels protect the Spree and canals from overflow during summer cloudbursts. Pumps keep the water level steady near deep foundations. The ground breathes through ventilation shafts and canal locks. The unseen engineering is as essential as any landmark above. Part 7. In East Berlin, the Ministry for State Security controlled a system that relied on secrecy and fear. The central remand prison at Hohenschönhausen began in 1945 as a Soviet special camp on an industrial site. In the early years, detainees were held in basement cells that survivors later called the submarine because it felt like a submerged hull with no daylight and no sense of time. Later buildings added interrogation rooms, corridors with coded routes, and a clinic. Prisoners were transported through side streets and coded doors so that they rarely saw another inmate. The prison processed thousands of political detainees over the decades, often for offenses like attempted escape or contact with the West. The Stasi maintained communications bunkers, secure telephone exchanges, and archival vaults. Some were in plain buildings with deep basements. Others sat in wooded compounds with fences and buried cables. In a crisis, the leadership had plans to relocate to hardened sites with independent power and water. Radio networks had backup control rooms designed to operate if the main exchanges were destroyed. After 1990, many sites were opened and catalogued. The archives at Normannenstrasse revealed a scale of surveillance documented in millions of pages and boxes. The underground infrastructure was not theatrical. It was functional, grey, and built to last. That ordinariness made it effective. Today, the prison at Hohenschönhausen is a memorial. Visitors walk past the basement cells and see the tiny doors and the small vents. Guides who were once prisoners explain interrogation routines designed to break the will without leaving marks. The corridors echo differently underground, and the sound lingers as you step back into daylight. The lesson is not just about one building, it is about how a state used space and secrecy to control people. The underworld here is a moral landscape as much as a physical one. Part 8. Between 1940 and 1945, Berlin endured hundreds of air raids. The British bomber offensive intensified in 1943. The United States Army Air Forces struck by day. The air raid siren became part of the soundscape of the city. By late 1943, Berliners moved with practiced speed to shelters. Public shelters existed in shopping arcades, in rail stations, and in freestanding bunkers with thick walls and blast towers. Many residential buildings had cellar shelters reinforced with brick arches and concrete. In some districts, the population density meant that every stairwell had a plan and a posted chart listing the nearest exits and fire equipment. One preserved shelter sits under Gesundbrunnen. It is a maze of rooms with simple benches, ventilation rotors, and emergency latrines. Walls were painted with luminous arrows that still glow under ultraviolet light. During a heavy raid, thousands could pack into spaces designed for far fewer. Carbon dioxide rose. The air grew hot. The sound of bombs arrived through the structure as dull punches. The shelter was a refuge, but not a guarantee. Near misses could collapse an entrance or rupture a water main. Gas mains were a constant fear. Fire brigades fought to keep stairwells free and to rescue those trapped by fallen beams. The big flak towers also served as refuges with multiple floors for civilians. They stored food and medical supplies and could generate power for days. Even they were not invulnerable. The surrounding districts often burned to the ground and roads choked with debris. After raids, women and older men, known as the rubble volunteers, climbed out and began to clear brick by brick. The shelters survived the war, along with their memory. In the 1950s, some were repurposed for storage. In the 1970s, West Berlin converted a number for civil defense against the nuclear threat. Beds were replaced, filters tested, and staff trained to seal doors within minutes. The capacity of that program could never match the population. It was an admission that the city could not be fully protected, but it was also a signal that the city would not surrender. Part 9. Total war pushed industry underground. Air raids threatened every factory rooftop. Berlin's industrial belt from Siemensstadt to Oberschöneweide adapted with shelters, cellars, and in some cases production lines moved below street level. In late 1943 and 1944, ministries coordinated programs to relocate critical workshops to tunnels and basements. Machine tools were installed in vaults and in newly dug galleries near rail sidings. Workers descended before dawn and emerged at night coated in dust. The aim was not comfort, but continuity. Every engine part and radio set mattered. Some facilities were simple. AEG and other firms strengthened cellars and cleared access routes to deliver components under blackout conditions. Other sites were more elaborate. The rail repair works built concrete galleries for storage and assembly near the S-Bahn yards. Spandau hosted armaments works tied to the canal and rail network, with shelters and fortified rooms threaded under the complexes. On the city outskirts, the army tested engines and materials at facilities connected by discrete service tunnels. The war's final months scattered this activity. Power failed, fuel ran out. Air raids cut rail links and trapped workers on the factory floor. The post-war story is equally underground. Many of these cellars and galleries did not return to peacetime use. Rubble filled some. Others flooded when pumps stopped. In the east, nationalized factories maintained shelters in case of civil defense needs. In the west, disused basements became storage or were sealed. After 1990, the city's industrial landscape shifted again. Some buildings were demolished, but cellars and sub-basements could not always be removed. Developers poured new slabs and built above them. In a few places, you can still find narrow doors that open to stairs leading to rooms with old stencil markings on the walls, the last traces of underground industry. The science of the city draws strength from this past. The knowledge that heavy loads must be spread on soft ground led to new foundation systems. The cost of pumping and ventilation taught planners to place workshops near existing tunnels and shafts. Today, when Berlin builds, the plan must consider what lies below. A forgotten cellar can stall a crane. A concrete vault can deflect a microtunnel by a few degrees. The map of industry is therefore a three-dimensional archive that stretches from the 19th century to the present. Part 10. Modern Berlin has not stopped digging. The new central station opened in 2006 with upper and lower decks crossed by long-distance lines and city lines. Deep under the glass roof, trains move through tunnels that run beneath the river and the government quarter. The Tiergarten tunnel carries traffic under the park. New utility tunnels carry heat, power, and fiber, linking districts through accessible corridors rather than a tangle of individual trenches. Climate adaptation adds another layer. Stormwater basins and interceptor tunnels help keep the Spree and Landwehr Canal clean during heavy summer storms. Sensors and remote valves manage flows in real time, a silent orchestra under the pavement. The reunified government quarter also required secure underground connections. Parliamentary buildings in the Spreebogen have service corridors that move staff, mail and equipment out of sight and out of weather. These are not dramatic to look at. They are concrete corridors with lighting and cameras and fire doors at intervals. Their value is reliability. A government can keep working during protests or storms without parading activity through the streets. The system is designed to protect people rather than to hide plots. The U5 extension completed in 2020 and the opening of Museums Insel in 2021 were feats of engineering under historic foundations. Tunneling near the museum quarter demanded soil freezing, micro-monitoring of movement in ancient masonry, and careful sequencing of excavation and support. The results allow a single train ride from Alexanderplatz to Brandenburger Tor. Under the surface of that ride are hundreds of sensors embedded in the ground, watching for changes smaller than a millimeter. The city now listens to its own underground. Teufelsberg's listening station found a new life as well. Artists and technicians use the old shells for exhibitions and experiments in sound. In summer, the wind hums through the radomes and the forest slowly reclaims the hill. The site embodies the pattern of the Berlin Underground. A ruin becomes a platform for a new layer without erasing the older ones. The same is true for many smaller sites, where a sealed doorway in a cellar becomes a gallery entrance or a data cable corridor. The hidden Berlin is not only a past tense, it is an active system with maintenance crews, archivists, engineers, and historians. Unexploded bombs from the war are still found every year in the city, and each discovery triggers controlled evacuations while specialists defuse or detonate the device. Archaeologists still uncover wells and wooden piles when new buildings go up. Railway planners still thread new tunnels through a forest of old ones. The underworld continues to evolve because Berlin continues to grow and to remember. Welcome back to the surface. The streets of Berlin look ordinary. Trams glide, cyclists ring bells, and the Spree moves quietly through the islands. Below all this is a second city. It is measured in kilometers of tunnel, in concrete poured in fear, and in the silver of water moving through brick. It is filled with dates that mark triumph and catastrophe. It is a textbook in 3 dimensions that explains how a modern city adapts to war, division, reunification, and climate. If you look closely, you will find traces everywhere. A vent in a sidewalk, a small steel door in a courtyard, a faint arrow painted long ago in luminous paint. What is hiding under Berlin is not a single secret. It is the city itself, written in layers, waiting to be read.